On February 28, 2026, the world's most critical shipping lane closed. Not because of a storm, not because of an accident, because of a war. Within 48 hours of US and Israeli forces striking Iran, the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which 20% of the world's daily oil supply flows, was effectively shut. And the question nobody in government is answering out loud is whether the global trading system was ever designed to survive what's happening right now. The giants of global shipping suspended transits simultaneously. Over 150 tankers anchored outside the strait rather than risk attack. And the Houthis, seizing the moment, resumed their assault on Red Sea shipping, eliminating what little alternative remained. For the first time in modern history, both of the Middle East's major maritime corridors were simultaneously blocked. This is AxisShift. Most people think of the global economy as something digital, as transactions on screens, as numbers moving through networks. But underneath that abstraction, the physical world still runs on ships. Nearly 80% of global trade by volume moves by sea. And much of that trade, energy, food, electronics, raw materials, passes through a handful of extraordinarily narrow waterways. Chokepoints, places where the entire flow of global commerce is compressed into passages sometimes just a few kilometers wide. Block one of them, and supply chains fracture. Block two simultaneously, and you have what the world is experiencing right now. The crisis unfolding in 2026 is being described by the International Energy Agency as larger than the oil shocks of 1973, 1979, and 2022 combined. Let's understand what these choke points actually are and why they hold such extraordinary power over the global economy. The Strait of Hormuz connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman. It is approximately 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Through it flows 20% of the world's daily oil consumption. When Iran closed the strait in February 2026, those countries were not rerouted. They were trapped. 20,000 seafarers are now trapped aboard roughly 2,000 vessels inside the Persian Gulf, unable to move. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait tells a similar story. This narrow passage at the southern end of the Red Sea connects the Indian Ocean to the Suez Canal and through it to European markets. Since late 2023, Houthi forces in Yemen have used this choke point as a weapon. By the time the Hormuz crisis hit in 2026, the Red Sea route to Europe was already operating at 49% of its pre-crisis capacity. The double blockade eliminated any near-term prospect of recovery. Carriers cannot enter the Red Sea from the south. They cannot exit the Gulf through Hormuz. Carriers cannot enter the Red Sea from the south. They cannot exit the Gulf through Hormuz. The Arabian Sea, which once served as the connective tissue between Asia, the Gulf, and Europe, has become a maritime dead end. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a different kind of choke point pressure was building. In January 2026, under significant US pressure, Panama's Supreme Court ruled that the Hong Kong conglomerate operating ports at either end of the canal had its contracts declared unconstitutional. Washington saw it as reclaiming strategic influence. Beijing saw it as provocation. China's response was swift, detaining 136 Panama-registered vessels at Chinese ports in April alone. And separately, years of climate-driven drought had already forced canal authorities to cut daily vessel transits by nearly 40%. 3 choke points, 3 simultaneous crises. Different causes, the same consequence. Here is what makes choke points so dangerous as geopolitical instruments. The cost of disruption is wildly asymmetric. A state actor, or even a non-state actor, like the Houthis, can impose enormous costs on the global economy using relatively modest military capabilities. A drone costing a few $1,000s can force a container ship worth hundreds of millions to reroute around the entire African continent. The Ever Given, a single container ship that ran aground in the Suez Canal for 6 days in 2021, cost an estimated $9 billion per day in delayed global trade. That was an accident. Iran understood this. What is happening in 2026 is deliberate. The choke points of global trade are not just logistical infrastructure, they are leverage. The country that can threaten a choke point can threaten the economies of every nation that depends on it. Iran understood this. By closing the Strait of Hormuz, Tehran imposed costs, not just on its direct adversaries, but on Japan, South Korea, India, and every other nation whose energy supply transits that strait. 70% of Japan's Middle Eastern oil arrives through Hormuz. Japan has no realistic alternative, which means a war between the United States and Iran creates an immediate energy crisis in Tokyo. That is the geometry of choke point warfare. It is not about sinking ships. It is about making the cost of commerce unpredictable enough that pressure to governments far from the conflict. So what does this mean for investors and the global economy? Energy costs are surging. Insurance premiums for vessels transiting conflict zones have risen more than 60%. Freight rates on Asia to Europe lanes are climbing again. Companies that spent years optimizing supply chains for cost and speed are now confronting a more fundamental question. Not what is the cheapest route, but which route will actually be open. The era of globalization was built on the assumption that shipping lanes were a utility, always available, always predictable, always cheap. That assumption is breaking apart in 2026. If you hold ETFs exposed to global logistics, energy, or manufacturing, the choke point crisis is already affecting the earnings of companies inside those funds. But the deeper story is this. The choke points of the world were carved by geography millions of years ago. They cannot be moved. They cannot be duplicated. And in a world where geopolitical competition is intensifying, the narrow waterways that global commerce depends on are becoming contested terrain. Every nation that sends goods by sea is exposed. They cannot be duplicated. The global economy runs on ships. The ships run through choke points. And in 2026, the world is discovering what happens when those choke points become battlefields. Subscribe to AxisShift, because the world is turning, and you should know which way.